Welcome to the Explorer Poet Podcast, an exploration of the blurry line separating our physical world from our abstract realities. Conversations and stories, myths and reality, science and the gods we worship, the esoteric and the everyday. Come explore with me. John Bonaduce, welcome to the Explorer Poet Podcast.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I came across you and your work initially through the Joseph Campbell Foundation Myth Blast newsletter, which I've actually found a number of guests on my podcast through the newsletter because it obviously covers things that I'm interested in and things that I think about. But it also, it connects me with people who have very similar thoughts to, or very similar interests to what I have. And so first of all, I would love to talk about some of your writing through the Myth Blast newsletter. But what really drew me to you and why I wanted to reach out is because of your experience at Pacifica Graduate Institute.
Really?
And and your thesis on mythobiogenesis.
Thank you.
And it's something that I've never seen in those terms before, or like in such detailed analytical terms, but it's something that I think about a lot because I read a lot of Joseph Campbell. I read a lot of Carl Jung. I read a lot of religious history, but I'm also very interested in the physical world. I've read a lot of books on evolution, and I've consumed a lot of podcasts on the topic as well. In from like a physics perspective, things that help me explain the physical world. And for this podcast, actually, one of the original ideas for me for hosting this podcast was this idea of exploring that fuzzy line or that blurry liminal space between our physical reality and the stories we tell ourselves, or like our inner experience. And so to come across someone who was actively involved in looking into this subject and writing about it, I thought I had to reach out to you.
No, that's a good reason that we should be talking, because those are my interests. And I guess it's my specialty now. And storytelling and how to tell stories was my portal to this whole subject and to Pacifica. Because by the time I realized that stories derived from myth and myth from biology, which is this essentially what I propose in all of my work, I'd found Pacifica, and they allowed me to pursue these ideas that I've carried alone for many decades. And they allowed me to explore them in a public setting. What a relief to no longer be working, just hearing my own voice with these ideas. It's a burden to have a truth and not to share it. It's a burden. There's an obligation to share it. Even if you're going to be laughed at, fine, get the laughing over with. Let me crawl back to obscurity, convinced I was wrong. But in the meantime, I'm telling you, 4 decades of work have led me to some remarkable insights into the origin of mythology that I never imagined I would be pursuing. And now it's been my whole adult life. Here I am.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's to me, and maybe it's just maybe my unique background, maybe your unique background, but to me, there almost isn't something more interesting. Because it almost is like a theory of everything for humans, where of course we interact with the physical world in some way, but almost everything that we do, everything that we think, everything that we perceive is coming through some kind of a filter. And we experience the world in a way that is very,
the word they often use is conditioned.
Yeah. It's conditioned to the way that we're the way the environment that we grow up in, the stories that we understand, the science that we accept. And there's a great Jungian book called Man and His Symbols, where Carl Jung and a number of other people go through, basically they just go through different dream symbology. But I remember in that book, somebody said that the difference between physics and psychology is essentially one is the outer world and one is the inner world. But in essence, it's the same thing. And I think when I think about reality, I can boil it down to this. There are basically two subjects, because there's psychology, which helps explain all of the human world, the religions, the philosophies, the cultures, the art. And then there's the physical world, which kind of boils down in essence to physics, because everything, if you think about the biomedical explanation even of psyche, everything boils down to cells and neurons and the brainstem, and it's all kind of this physical thing. And so if the world kind of narrows down to these two, physics and psychology, are they not just two sides of the same coin anyways?
Yeah. Is what Campbell explained that Kant had in mind. I'm not as overwhelmed with Campbellian joy when I read Kant. I think I really hurt my brain trying to get Kant in a complete understanding. But if I understand it correctly, for Campbell, the big deal about Kant was he understood that what is true in the farthest reaches of the universe are also true in our brains. The same physical laws that we perceive and figured out are going to operate correctly and ultimately at the farthest reaches under the most extreme conditions. Actually, that turned out not to be true, because most of physics falls to pieces at the beginning of our universe, as you probably have read many times. And during Planck time, 1 and 1 doesn't equal 2. It's where the things that we count on just don't hold up anymore. But other than that, yeah, there's a link and a connection between the physical and the psychological.
Okay. Well, I want to make sure that I don't just ramble about the thoughts that I have. So I want to ask you, from your experience, maybe it would be good to go back to that question of what got you started in this whole world anyways? Like what drew you to stories, and then eventually to connecting that to, this idea of story or myth coming out of our biology. But what was it in your early life or your experience that drew you to this?
I used to come up with stories spontaneously from my fascination with an author, Ray Bradberry. Have you ever read Ray Bradberry?
No, I don't know Ray.
Yeah, you have to check him out. He's passed away now, but his stories were like little revelations, and I wanted to be like him. I also wanted to be like my dad. My dad was a writer. He wrote situation comedies, and he wrote for Dick Van Dyke and One Day at a Time, things like that. And pretty top quality shows. And he was a storyteller and a joke writer, but one of the most serious man I've ever known. I mean, he had his preoccupations tended to be with the decline of Western civilization. I'm not sure what he was doing in comedy. But I did learn from watching him that writing you could make money writing. And, you met people. It was very impressive. Yeah, if you were a writer in Hollywood. And I was already writing stories. So, hey, you know what? I was thinking when I was thinking about talking to you, and we might get to this. I've never mentioned this, but I think one of my stories, the earliest one I sold, was a science fiction. And it was on the nature of time. And it was for a show called Love American Style. Do you remember seeing that show in rerun or something?
No, I don't.
Okay. It was how shall I put it? It was episodic, No, it was anthology, and within each half hour, there would be maybe four little vignettes, or there would be one long one, maybe 20 minutes. And I wrote a story, Love and the Time Machine, it was called. And in this story, it was sort of a sorcerer's apprentice. Now, you know, us mythologists, we always, if we don't derive our story from a previous form, we'll wonder why. We'll look for that form. Well, mine was the sorcerer's apprentice. The guy who's tasked with watching over the time machine, guarding it, is he wants to impress a girl. So he has his girl, the girl he has his eyes on, come over to the apartment where he keeps this time machine. And she comes in and he kind of makes a move on her, and she is appalled and walks out the door, and he's bereft. And then he realizes he has a time machine, and he turns back time 15 minutes, and she comes in again, and he tries a slightly different approach. And then he keeps doing it until she's always having her first drink. He's on his, like, he's had, a fifth of whiskey by the time she actually says yes to his advances. But he's too wasted at that point to do anything about it. Great show. But you know what, Josh? I started a trend there. I am the, what do you call it? I am the origin source for that time wrinkle story, like
Yeah. Sounds
50
like,
First Dates.
yeah, or Groundhog's Day.
Or Groundhog's Day. There's a bunch of them. And they're all over the place. And somebody's going to do a study someday, and they're going to trace it back to old John Bonaduce. And that'll be a great day. I'll probably be dead, but yeah, I came up with that, and it's a good thing. Now, you asked me a question, a legitimate question about connecting this story and this work I do. Because I've left the business, Josh. I left that cool business to do this. Oh, man. Mythobiogenesis doesn't pay 6 figures a year. You know what I mean? But writing jokes, and I'm still good at it. Here's the deal. I wanted to be faster and better as a sitcom writer than I was. All these other guys, some of them were hacks and gals. My dad was no hack, but damn, he could pull out a 2-act format out of his ear. It was amazing. And I thought, what's the nature of storytelling? What is the origin? At the same time, Josh, I don't know about your ups and downs in life, but my scholastic record was so crappy. I was always getting straight A's and then getting straight F's, you know? It was a terrible pattern. And so now I'm in my late 30s, and I'm thinking I want to go back to school and get my BA. But I want to keep writing. But I'm really interested in story origins, and I have to take a general ed class at my age at UCLA. Why do I want to go to hear about biology at this point? And that changed everything. And I even remember the name. Let's see if I remember the name. Durstenfeld, Professor Durstenfeld at UCLA, taught biology in a way that I saw had similarities in structure to the stories and the story formats I was working with. And especially the hero stories, that Campbell talks about a lot. And I realized the ultimate biological hero story is the story of the male sex cell, the gamete, the sperm, fighting its way through a myriad of obstacles to reach the egg. And then I realized, bingo, I got it. It's, there's a connection between this template laid down by nature herself and these stories. And so I pursued that. And when I looked up, I had a BA finally at age 40, 2 kids, and a theory. Um, and I named my kids Dominic and Celia, and my theory, Mythobiogenesis. Uh, and and I've worked it and worked it and worked it until I had data to back it up. And I guess it boils down to this. We remember conception as the ultimate hero story, but we also remember the events leading up to conception, which is like ovulation. And those have stories. They're ovulation stories. And there are even, well, stories about the journey to the egg, not just that moment, but and they all pencil out into these great myths and religions. Josh, I can't, it's kind of almost offensive even to me. I mean, I'm a practicing Catholic, and what my theory does to Catholicism is a real issue. I don't discuss my theory too much at the 10 o'clock Mass.
Well, okay, so I want to get into that. Like, what is it specifically about the theory that would make it, I don't know, uncomfortable at 10 o'clock Mass? But I also just want to clarify. So, like, your theory on mythobiogenesis is essentially that that you can look at all these natural biological processes, and if you look at them through the right lens, I guess, you can actually see the story arcs, and you can see the characters that would be like the archetypes or the different aspects of story that we see. You could see those in there, and I guess maybe my question is, how do we get from like these biological processes happening, these natural processes, to humans actually telling stories? Is there like a direct connection that you have in your work where you can point to how these end up as things that are going on as thoughts in our brain and as stories that we're telling each other?
Well, I'm reading right now about research where child and infant play is frequently a reenactment of trauma that is neonatal, that means of newly born, or the birth trauma itself, or prenatal, pre-birth traumas and memories being told as stories. That's kind of what's going on here. And the body has a will to tell these stories, but the stories are a bit of a camouflage. The author, and I don't know if we call ourselves the author or the psyche is the author. The psyche, which for Jung, if you recall, included everything, conscious and unconscious. The psyche conspires to tell a story. And it has no interest in the outer reality. It has no interest in telling the story of Plato's Atlantis. It has no interest in islands. It has no interest in gods, or deluges of civilizations or people suffering. It uses these to get our attention. We are a bit dulled to the psyche. We are dulled to the spiritual realities. And the psyche knows that. So it takes what it wants us to remember. It wants us to remember our origin. I don't know why. It wants us to remember that once we were a spirit without any cultural conditioning. We were just spirit meeting flesh, floating through this uterine acidic environment. It wants us to know this story for some reason. So it tags these story elements of its own, its structural points, with things it thinks we will find interesting. Um, you know, it gives us, instead of an island, instead of an egg, which is kind of dull, a microscopic egg, it gives us an entire continent and called Atlantis. The smallest is made big, so we'll notice it. The mind, the psyche works like its own microscope. It wants us to notice this tiny stuff. And if it tells the story right, we'll notice. Now, what the end game of this existential reality I'm describing is, I don't know. I may know in a couple more years. I'm still studying this. But that's the point. It's all camouflage. All cells are interested, and these are cells telling stories. The ovum is a cell. The fertilized cell is a cell. All they're interested in is cell stories. They don't care about Noah or Plato or Jesus. They just want to tell their cell stories. And they'll give us a Jesus. They'll give us a Last Supper. They'll give us salvation. They'll give us resurrection if we will just take notice of the one story that interests the cell, which is the cell.
Yeah, I think I got this from Joseph Campbell. I'm pretty sure, either Joseph Campbell or Karen Armstrong. But one of the purposes of story or myth is to bring us closer to consciousness. And what you're saying from a biology perspective, it sounds very similar in that your body wants the cells of your body want you to remember a thing. They want you to remember your origin story. And the interesting thing about the psyche is that it does camouflage stories. The stories, back when you were saying every good mythologist realizes that when they're writing a story, what they're actually doing is telling a story that's been told forever, and they're just covering it with new context, or they're putting new labels, new locations, new characters, but it's the same story. And I think what ends up happening is that we take stories, we take myth, and it's, these symbols, these symbolic representations of stories is the only way the psyche can give it to us. It doesn't have a language of words to give us what it wants us to understand. And even if it could, we might be a little too resistant to it. Maybe because of that.
You may have answered your own question. In fact,
yeah,
it wasn't in my thinking, but you said it's pointing us in the direction of consciousness. That's probably what I've called it, the cell, what the cell wants. That sounds ridiculous, but language fails to be really useful when we get to this pre-language world. It's the equivalent of the Planck time in physics, where everything falls apart, our rules fall apart. Well, the period of time I'm talking about in the psyche, language falls apart and ceases to be helpful sometimes. I got to really dig deep. I mean, we're talking about memory before mind. And that's a tricky thing because when we say memory, we're thinking of neurons. May I point out, Josh, right now, so there's no confusion, when I say memory, I'm not talking about anything as big and cumbersome as a neuron. This is way before the neuron. There's some kind of memory, and it makes itself evident whether we believe it can or not. My data is actual data. They're stories. But if you line them up with the stories of conception, gastrulation, organogenesis, it's a marvelous correlation. And to deny that there's a relationship between these microscopic events and these macroscopic religions and rituals, it takes an act of will once you've read my work. I mean, it's pretty convincing.
Yeah,
I think it's.
I could see that. Yeah,
It wants us to know what consciousness is. This is consciousness saying, hey, we're bigger than you. Look here, before that your culture took you over and taught you that you're Catholic and Muslim or Jewish, or taught you that you're a scientist or a ballet dancer. Before that, look here to what you were. You were already thinking. In fact, I'm going to say something I've said before, but never to someone. I think at conception, they talk about, are we conscious? When does consciousness build? Is there any such thing? Absolutely, there's a consciousness. And I'm going to say that consciousness starts out at a high point and diminishes for the rest of one's life. Occasionally, a saint or a really talented, insightful sinner can dig their way back to these early insights. And thus, we end up with a ritual that reenacts these cellular events. How amazing is that? And the reason the 10 o'clock Mass is problematic for me is that when we hold up the wafer, we say, this is my body, this is my blood. Well, we're reenacting conception, this little wafer of a cell, and suddenly, instead of being nothing, there's somebody there. Woohoo! That's conception, man. Right in front of us on an altar. I don't like to tell Catholics that because while it would be supportive of some of their most cherished ideals, the price of entry into my theory is jettisoning a lot of unwanted theological baggage, which, as a practicing Catholic musician, I'm more than happy to put up with. I just want to be there. I love my church. They can throw me out if they want. That'd be cool, actually. That's the kind of man I was in the old days. I was that way with women. I shouldn't say this, but because as a weak man, I would just act like an idiot until they got rid of me because I didn't want to take responsibility for ending the relationship. What a jerk. I think I'm doing the same thing with the church. I'm tiptoeing up to what they'll tolerate and hoping I'll have my Galileo moment where they call me into the office and say, John, we've been reading your work about the Eucharist.
Yeah.
There's a problem. And then I would have my Galileo moment. But then I'd lose my gig as a musician, and I'm pretty good at it. So,
well, I think that, first of all, I think it's good that you're being honest about it all. But also I think that what you're saying about religion and the rituals of religion is this reenactment of this, you're basically saying a biological process. I think that it just feels intuitively right. And I think the big challenge with religion and culture in general, all of our belief systems, which they expand much farther than just religion, but all of our belief systems are, what we do is we take these symbolic acts and we literalize them way too much.
Well, exactly. That's why Campbell's so important. He teaches the world to stop literalizing scripture. It's useless. And it makes scripture worthless to literalize it.
It really does. It really takes the value out of it. But if you don't literalize it, if you can look at it from I say either mystical or psychological way, if you can look at it as these are the processes, it's like a mirror. Whatever religion you believe is like a mirror of your own psychology. It's showing you the types of psychological processes that you've fallen into, or the patterns that you have fallen into, the archetypes that you've identified with. And I can see how, for me, it's not that difficult to connect, the consumption of a wafer with conception, because you're right. You're doing the same thing. You're taking this small seed-like object and you're placing it within a body, and then it's supposed to become something else. Well, that is conception, right?
It is.
And similar, if you think about any of them, if you think about baptism, it's supposed to be a death and a rebirth, but if it is a rebirth, then does that not represent your mother's womb? And are you not coming up again out of your, like coming out again out of your mother's womb to become like a child, which again, what you were saying about that high point of consciousness where it's somewhere near conception, that, you know, the ritual itself is trying to get us back to that space where we are stripped as much as possible from our cultural conditioning. But it only works that way if you don't read it literally. If you read it literally, then baptism can actually entrench you further in the cultural conditioning. But if you're reading it psychologically, and you can really understand that it's supposed to release you from these ideas. It's supposed to set you, clean your slate, you know, become sin-free and start over again like a little child. Then
Josh, do you believe that that the writers of this stuff, the people who wrote these scriptures, and that, when I say scriptures, I mean all scriptures, the Upanishads or the Quran or the New Testament or the Old Testament, do you think that they were manipulators and liars, or were they artists who just loved to write these?
Yeah, yeah.
All of those answers make them sound like lightweights, and I don't know. I don't see. That's not my. What do you think?
I think
are they honest men and women, or?
I think that it's going to be a mixed bag. So what I mean by that is that if you look at the Old Testament as an example, or look at any of the, like you mentioned the Upanishads, they are, at some point, these stories are so old that before they were ever written down, the people already knew them. They were reiterated as oral traditions. And at that, if you go that far enough back, if you go, you know, that far back, I would guess that the original stories that we told each other were probably the dreams that we had at night, and we woke up and shared our dreams.
It. Yeah, I don't think they were people. Do you ever keep a dream journal?
I do, yeah, and I kind of go off and on with it, and sometimes I have very vivid dreams, and to the point where it's just too much. I can't keep up, and and then my life will get busy. I'll focus on something else, and I'll have to come back to my dreams later, but. Yeah, I think that what you're saying about artists is correct. I think that the origin of all of these stories, of all art, all music, all poetry, all painting, sculpting, I think it's art in the sense that it like comes up out of our unconscious and we create it. But what ends up happening with art is that what I believe an artist is doing is, through their art, they're showing their society the experience that they've had in this culture. And so at some level, a lot of the members of the society will connect with it on an emotional level, or maybe an unconscious level. They'll go, yes, you know, this also represents me. And at some point, the story, the art changes the story enough to where you have some kind of a movement or like a revolution psychologically. And I think that's when the bad actors, the bad faith actors step in,
right,
and start using it to their advantage. So when Jesus Christ came along, he wasn't a member of a church. You know, he was kind of an outsider from all of the known cultural situations. And he was sharing a message of, hey, let's actually examine the law and decide whether or not it makes us actually good people. And then let's do the thing that is good. And with enough time, people became converted to those ideas. And then with enough time, those ideas became institutionalized. And then they become, there are definitely people who step in as manipulators to use those stories to their advantage.
Yes, obviously. I mean, and to assuage their consciences. I mean, the slave owners were invariably Christian. You know, it's a terrible reality. And the Bible could be used to bolster their belief in slavery. So yeah, that's
yeah.
But what I was getting at is, like you, I will occasionally keep a dream journal, especially if that dream is what Jung and Campbell and those folks call the big dream. You try and capture it, right? You've been there, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, you're writing it down. Well, that to me, that's where the scripture comes from. These men and women weren't trying to fake us out. Maybe later they were, but initially they're just trying to capture it before it disappears. They know it's important. They don't know what it means necessarily, but they know it's important and they write it down. So I don't think anybody's trying to tell us a tall tale. They are tall tales, but that wasn't their intent. And in many cases, they are deliberately, according to my theory, misdirection. I mean, they're directing you to something else entirely.
Yeah, just the way that you were saying the cell or the body is using some kind of story imagery to direct us towards something. Same thing with dreams, same thing with what you would call prophetic vision or artistic vision.
Yeah.
Again, it's never exactly what is represented. It's
No.
it's trying to
And
get us to something deeper.
and that's important because all religion wants us to get to a higher level of consciousness. And many fail to do that. In fact, some deliberately stunt us. But these stories, once they're understood, are clearly trying to show us where our consciousness used to be. Like Moses creeping up toward the burning bush. Well, to me, that and 1,000 other images like it is what experience of the male sex cell about to become life, approaching the female sex cell, engulfed by other competing cells. And that is a holy moment. And the Bible tells us so. Take off your shoes, buddy. You're on holy ground. Yeah. This is the source of religion. This is your holy ground. And so there's the image before conception. See, these stories, they're all over the place, but they're very unified. In fact, I make the point in my dissertation that the whole story of Exodus, which is supposed to take place over 40 years, is essentially happened over a weekend. You know, it's a story of a sexual encounter and a subsequent pregnancy. So
Remind me of that one. So you're talking
Well-
about the children of Israel wandering in the desert for 40 years?
Yes.
Yeah.
I suggest that they were wandering for about 7 days or less. It takes 7 days for the cell, once it's fertilized, to actually make it to the endometrium, the promised land, and make its footing secure. In the Bible, of course, it actually makes it a footing. The priests stand in the river for some reason and sink into the soil, the wet soil. Well, that's what happens when we're rooting to the endometrium. So yeah, I'm saying that the Ark of the Covenant being carried in a box across the desert for 40 years is actually a homologous fertilized cell. 2 tablets, okay, of the 10 commandments. Well, 2 homologs, 2 homologous cells side by side becoming one. There's your God. There's your God story. They travel, they land, they implant, they proliferate, they become the chosen people. Actually, these stories become even more sacred to me once I dispense with the secondary elaboration, which I have no use for. I love stories. You see what happened to me, Josh? I wanted to make some dough, man. I wanted to be where the action was. I wanted to be with the in crowd. I'm just like everybody else, except I have this fascination with looking, as Hillman would say, through. I have to look through, even if I don't want to. You know, all I wanted was to get better at writing little shows and do them quickly. Unfortunately or fortunately, I went another direction.
Yeah, well, there's something about Hollywood where stories are meant to be entertainment. And it's hard because I actually have this working theory of my own that the stories that stick around, we have this way of consciously describing why we like them. So the example I use often is Peter Pan, just because I think about that story a lot. As a culture, we look at Peter Pan and using our words, we can say, oh, we love Peter Pan because it's a fun story about how you never have to grow up. And from but the theory that I have is that stories actually stick with us unconsciously because it's our unconscious that connects with them, because there's some part of us that we're not aware of that's saying, this is the story that you need to transcend what you're going through to get to that next level of consciousness. And when you look at the story of Peter Pan, sure, it's fun. There's pirates, there's kids living in the woods, you can fly, there's like fairies and Indians, and it's like all this fun stuff. But what the real story is about kids who are lost. And why are they lost? It's because they don't have a mother. And
Yeah.
and then Captain Hook is this representation of the tyrannical adult, the tyrannical parent, the mother or the father. And this is a person who despises children. They hate children. And what happens is the leader of the children is this guy named Peter Pan, and he's this Pan character that's been represented as the trickster, eternal child through all of myth, as this part of you that never does grow up. And Captain Hook despises that part of children. And the interesting thing about Captain Hook is that in order for him to grow up, he had to cut off a part of himself. So who cut that part off? It was Pan. And so you could look at Captain Hook's hook, his hand that used to be a hook, and you could say that's the part of himself that he had to cut off. And where did it go? It went into the belly of the crocodile along with the clock. And so he now represents time, and he's always being chased by time. So he's this person that in order to grow up, he had to sacrifice the Peter Pan part of himself, the eternal child. And so now he hates children. And then if you look at all of the adults in Neverland, they're pirates, they're tyrants. And Captain Hook has this partner, his name is Shmi. And Shmi is fine when Captain Hook's not around. Shmi is kind of like easygoing, he's friendly with the pirates, he could probably even get along with the Lost Boys and Peter Pan. But when the tyrant comes back, when the captain comes back, then Shmi immediately has to become the tyrant himself, and he supports Captain Hook. And I think that's how most of us grew up. Most of us grew up with parents, one of whom was kind of the emotional tyrant of the house, and the other one was much easier to get along with when the main tyrant wasn't around. But as soon as they came back, they were always on the side of the pirates and never on the side of the children. And so there, you could see how if you start looking into the imagery of this, why is, we have this society of lost children because of the way that our parents raise us, and not blaming them because they also were raised by parents who were doing the same thing. But this is just an example of this theory that I have, that the stories that stick with us because our unconscious sees what they're trying to tell us. And so this is all of the religions, this is the cultural stories, this is all the superhero stories that Disney is making today. There's something about these stories that stick with us unconsciously. And then just in the same way that we literalize the scriptures, we literalize all these stories by saying, oh, well, Peter Pan is great because we never have to grow up.
Right. Actually, Peter Pan helps me in the same way that what's his name? Parsifal. The story of Parsifal helps me. Another fellow who never quite grew up. Do you remember the story?
Parsifal is from the round table stories?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. He's all of us, and I'm going to say men and women, but particularly men who stumble into the world unprepared, and they're goofy little babies, and they don't know it. And they don't grow up, and they're very effective in society because they're so wild and unrestrained. But when I read of Parsifal, it actually made me feel better about myself. And Peter Pan, I used to think, who am I in this story? Don't tell me I'm Captain Hook. No, I'm the guy who didn't grow up. But it's kind of nice to know that that's who I was. So I can move away from that, because you do have to grow up, unfortunately. So Parsifal, when I read that story, now what did I read it? Parsifal shows up in the first ever book of the Arthurian legends. The one by Troy de Troyes, Trois, the author, and just unprepared for the world, and unprepared for women, and unprepared for men who contend against him, full of idiot notions that preserve him because he just doesn't know that he's in mortal danger. That was me. That was me. I don't know how I survived my 20s, but I was Parsifal. And myth is helpful for placing me in my own. I read the word inner pantheon. Where did I read that recently? Was that something to do with your podcast?
I don't know if I've talked about inner pantheons. Maybe I have, but it sounds like a very like an understandable term.
Yeah.
The archetypes inside. Yeah.
I really don't distinguish between the validity of religions, how they're interpreted. I do, but
with what you're saying about, even if it's uncomfortable to talk about at Mass, what you're saying about the stories of the Catholic Church. I grew up Mormon, LDS. I think it's pretty far removed, but there are still Christian elements, and you could say a lot of that comes from somewhere. And yeah, if you read religion literally, I think you're right. It actually becomes unhelpful. And I don't think it's true if you read it literally. What most religious people don't understand is that all of their religions are true, but you have to read it in the right way.
And Campbell was good at explaining that.
Yeah, he was.
I used to say, I still say, it's very annoying to people, but and this brings us back, you said you wanted to talk about Pacifica. One of the things I noticed about Pacifica was that many of the students were very reluctant to ever discuss religion per se. And I wondered what they're doing here. I mean, and if the professor was also of that mind, I wondered what he or she was doing here.
Yeah.
All of these myths contained religious power at one time, and then they were stepped down, so but they still contained psychological power, which is a very insulting thing to say, by the way, to a believer. Oh yes, your stories still have validity, but only in a psychological sense. But it's true. It's true. People quit their religions before they know why they are quitting. Figure it out, buddy. Stick with it. Yeah, you're right. There's some malarkey going on, to use a ridiculous Joe Biden word from the 19th century. There's a lot of nonsense in the scripture. You got that. No, but you haven't figured out what isn't the malarkey. You haven't stayed long enough. And I just find that I am invested. So that's the thing about Pacifica. I couldn't figure out why, a friend of mine would say, oh God, they're going to talk about Jesus Christ. Duh. That's a major myth, man.
It's the biggest myth in the Western world.
Hell yes.
Yeah. It's interesting though, because the people who are adamant religious believers, the literalists who believe, it's interesting because if you look at the way that they believe, the atheists who are adamantly against them are making the exact same logical mistake, where they're literalizing. The atheists are doing the same thing, where they literalize the myth and then act as if it's not true.
You're right. They do. They reject they grab the low hanging fruit, which is literalism, and they
Yeah,
reject the whole thing. Yeah,
that's
yeah,
right.
you're
Yeah.
right.
So even this group that's kind of popular, has been popular. I think they're falling out of popularity, but they call themselves the neo-atheists. Their whole thing is how dumb religious people are, but they're making the exact same assumption error.
Right.
And so they can't see. So what I think is that, and maybe this will circle back to your theory of mythobiogenesis, but what I think is that the human brain, the way that it thinks is stories. And so we can't take in a single little bit of information, a single data point, and just hold it in isolation. Everything gets integrated into some kind of a story within us, and we have to explain everything as a story. And I think it makes sense. There's like this spiritual side of us, and a lot of people, these neo-atheists included, they want to avoid it because it's too woo-woo. The spirituality, it gets too close to religion, but we're trying to explain things in a scientific way. But if you really think about the human brain, it has to think in some way. It must conceptualize the world in some way. And I believe that the way that we do it is through stories.
The storytellers of Hollywood are an amazing group. My dad was one. I was one. And and they go to coffee shops and think of these stories, which they got to pitch to some old guy from the 1960s or 70s. They got to pitch these stories, and they have to be verbal storytellers. We see the end product. We may see an old situation comedy with a laugh track and dismiss it, and rightfully so most of the time. But the storytellers are sitting in these coffee shops coming up with ways to tell their stories of Lucy and Desi getting in a argument in Italy over how to make wine. They're telling these stories for a reason. They need to be expert verbal storytellers. Before the cameras roll, they have to not only tell it, they have to be amusing and draw the co-producer and the star into their little world and tell their story and act out the parts and deliver the gags and take home the contract. Well, they're real storytellers. They live, throw a stick, you'll hit 10 of them. I live in North Hollywood. Believe me, it's an ancient tradition. They're everywhere. And I like those guys and gals. Um, Ultimately, I wasn't one of them, and I don't know why. Huh.
Do you want to spend time thinking about that or talking about that? Is there something beyond just being that storyteller from a get a contract perspective that you want to do something deeper than that?
Well, everybody does who's an artist. I mean, I don't want to, you know, there was an old Twilight Zone that with Donald Pleasance. Um, and I know you've seen the Twilight Zone. Everybody's seen it on Thanksgiving. They show the marathon. And Donald Pleasance is a teacher who's being fired after 50 years. And he's got a class full of students saying goodbye. And he suddenly realizes these are all his former students. And they've all died from old age, some of them, and in wars. And they've come back to tell him how great he was. He didn't fail. And he says at the end, be ashamed to die unless you have won some victory for humankind. Okay, there's that. And then there's a six-figure income. Yeah, I want one of those. I want to win a victory for humankind. And I want six figures. I'll settle for the victory. It's more important to me.
Yeah.
I still
yeah.
want both. But and I do have stories and I have gimmicks and gags, and I'm thinking of my own podcast. Because I have to. I was given a gift for structure, for narrative, for comedy. And I hate not to use it. You know, I don't want to be a dilettante, but I'm not. It's all my work is all related. My storytelling and my mythologizing. It's all related. Yes, I do have some products in the pipeline. I have a screenplay I just finished. Yes, so and the answer is yes. Tell you a story. Uh, my neighbor, I guess I can talk about him. My neighbor Steve, I was gardening and he's gardening. And his wife is gardening. We're all gardening. His wife says, you two should write something together. I think, take it back. And before I could say anything, my politeness got the better of me. I said, "Oh, that'd be a great idea." And you know what, Josh? I spent the next 2 years turning a short story my neighbor had written into a wonderful screenplay. And I don't work on other people's stuff. I am so selfish. I just want my stuff to glow. But I liked his story. And I realized after a lifetime, well, 40 years of theorizing and writing and going back to graduate school at my age, I'm hilarious. Dude, I'm hilarious. I wrote the best sci-fi comedy that I've ever seen since, what is it, Guardian of the Galaxy? Or what was that one with the best sci-fi comedy is, what's that one where there's a kind of a Shatner character, but actual aliens think he's the real thing and
Yeah,
they come.
that's the Tim Allen movie.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
I can't remember the name, but I know, yeah, it's funny. My kids didn't
Wasn't it
think my
great?
kids didn't think it was as funny, but they're still young.
Yeah,
But
they'll get
yeah,
it.
but
They'll get it. Well,
I think it's funny.
I wrote something with Steve as funny as that, called Space Court. Well, right away, that's a great concept. Space Court. Because we're going to have court in space and there's going to be space law and all that stuff. Anyway, it's a wonderful screenplay. So yes, I'm still in the game. Well, no, I'm not. I think I'm inching my way back. I fell out. And as anyone in the industry will tell you, once you fall out, you're out, and it's exciting. It's like being outside the gates, trying to get back in. Maybe. I have a couple of products that will be worth pursuing. 40 years of pursuing mythobiogenesis, Josh. I'm ready to stand back and make a little dough and make some sales and, yeah. I'm still interested in telling stories and writing jokes. And
Well, do you think it could be that there was a part of you that really needed to understand what you were doing, like on a very fundamental level, not just from a making money, getting projects made perspective, but you really wanted to understand. Well, if you wrote something down, you wanted to be able to tie it to the myth that actually matters, or at least you wanted to understand why these things bubbled up inside of you.
it is the nature of my intellect, probably yours, and probably every one of my wonderful colleagues at Pacifica, to want to know. It's not unique to me, certainly. And it's not something I developed consciously. It's part of my equipment. I'm interested. I want to know. And now that I do know, I can go back to the story. I can go back to the fun of selling a story. Uh, um, and since this conversation is wide ranging, you've made that clear. Let me say that in this era of podcasting, shame on old guys like me who sit back on their hands and don't try their hand at this, at creating a product. Because the means of production, to sound very Marxist, and I'm not a Marxist, the means of production, I've been called a Marxist lately, because I am angry at politics these days, and the other folks call me a Marxist, which is hilarious.
Anytime you disagree, you're going to get a label. So
yeah, I'll take that one. But anyway, so I'm looking for stories that will tell the truth. Mostly I just want to make people laugh again. You know, that's what my dad did. That's what my family's good at. So
Yeah, well, I think the quickest way to make people laugh is the truth. It's got to be, you got to reveal
and
the
that's
truth,
it.
the truth that other people don't want to talk about. Yeah.
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 I can definitely relate to the idea of really wanting to understand. Always been something inside of me that wanted to be a writer. It's kind of like I always kind of knew I was a writer, but it took a long time to get to a point where I felt like I had anything worth writing about. And what it took was like kind of that death and rebirth cycle, losing my religion, going out to kind of rediscover, what all this was about. And that's where I came across the Joseph Campbells and the Carl Jungs. And in reading that type of material, I did feel like I was getting to the bottom of something. And now I feel like I have plenty to write about because I can look back at all of my experiences and see them through a more conscious lens. But also in regards to podcasts, like this podcast, I love conversations, but I wouldn't be able to have this conversation with you if I hadn't also gone back and kind of tried to get to the bottom of things. And so I think there's some real value in it from an artistic perspective because, yeah, even this podcast, I think is a great, it's a great way to kind of explore and create. It's creating a product or a piece of art that I can put out in the world.
You're also creating writing. Campbell, like half of Campbell's work, published work, are from recordings. Lectures he gave, and they're transcribed and they become his work. You're creating volumes of text. That's kind of neat. It's a shortcut to a vast amount of writing. And I told my brother that, who's a radio guy, a DJ, and he's more than a DJ, has his own show. And he'd been on for years. And I told him, give me your texts. I'll edit them in a book form. He's a very clever guy. So it's a shortcut to writing. And it's the same process in many ways,
Yeah.
Campbell did it all the time. Also, before that, a lot of his work was from his lectures in class, and you can tell it's very conversational. So
yeah, absolutely.
I wish I was a working professor just for that. So I'd have this backlog of material. I'd be generating content. When I was at Pacifica, and here's the difference between me and a young student going back. A young student wants to get A's on their paper. Well, so do I. Sure, I'm an affirmation junkie. But each time they write a paper, it's a one-off. When I wrote a paper, Josh, every one of those papers had to circle back to mythobiogenesis, or I didn't write it. And there were occasions where that would be a force, and I had to go along with the program. But even then, every assignment was meant by me to be publishable. And I didn't understand anyone who wasn't thinking along those terms. Why would you spend hours writing something for a grade or a degree when you could end up with dozens of publishable works? And I didn't think like that in college the first time. But when you're in your 60s, you think that way,
Yeah.
You don't want to waste a moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Pacifica was a good deal. They're profit-based, and it's easy to turn up your nose at that. I do. But they're staffed by geniuses. And I learned more than I have at any other school. And I've been to some good schools.
Yeah. I don't have any intention of going back to school, but obviously given the topics that I'm interested in, if I ever did, I think it would be something very similar to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But this you were talking about shortcuts, and I think that one of the things that's great about this podcast is it's a shortcut to having conversations with people that I couldn't really interact with otherwise. I couldn't just go out into the wild and find people, writers, thinkers, artists, people like you. And it's been really great. And I want to, we're over an hour now, so I want to be understanding of your time and give you the rest of the afternoon. But John, I really appreciate this conversation and the ideas that you're wrestling with and that you're compiling data and information and stories about. Very interesting to me. So I'm definitely on your side, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah. If anybody wants to find out what you've written or what you're working on, where would they find you online?
Well, online, my site is Bonaduce. What is it? Bonaduce at gmail. Well, I forget my site. My Gmail is jbonaduce52 at gmail.com. jbonaduce at gmail.com. And I would welcome and eagerly receive any questions. But there's also, I should tell you, Josh, where all this has taken me. The scientific community, which for most of my life I was just a voice howling outside the gates, has sort of let me in a little bit. I'm on the editorial board for a beautiful science journal. I'm so grateful. JOPA, it's called, the Journal of Pre and Perinatal Psychology and Health. Thank God somebody in there recognized that I'm not just a goof off. I've got the goods. And I was tapped by a fellow named Thomas Verney, Dr. Thomas Verney, MD, very well-known fellow. He's known as the father of prenatal psychology. That's where my work can be seen. Most recently, I was just published there about 8 months ago or something. And so look me up, and I'll always respond.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks, John. And I'll make sure that I link your website and that journal in the show notes as well, so people can click through.
Thanks, Josh. And I'll figure out my own website in a moment. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.